I'm a forensic pathologist, or at least I was, until I sold Blackwood Associates Funeral Home last month and returned to city practice. You can call me Dr. Elena Vasquez. For nearly 4 years, I ran what was supposed to be a peaceful rural funeral home in Thornfield Hollow, West Virginia. But what I discovered, buried in those meticulous records, made me question everything I thought I knew about death, identity, and the very fabric of reality itself, ultimately forcing me to abandon the quiet mountain life I'd grown to cherish and flee back to the anonymity of urban medicine. The Blackwood Associates had been serving the coal mining families and mountain communities of Thornfield Hollow for over 75 years, when I inherited it from my mentor, Dr. Margaret Blackwood, in March 2019. Dr. Blackwood wasn't a blood relative, but she might as well have been. She had been my anatomy professor at West Virginia University Medical School, then later my supervisor during my forensic pathology residency at Charleston Area Medical Center. When she retired from academic medicine in 1992 to take over her family's funeral home business, she maintained our professional relationship through occasional consultations on complex cases. Dr. Blackwood had always been more than a mentor to me. As one of only 3 female forensic pathologists in West Virginia during the 1980s and 1990s, she had blazed trails that made my own career possible. She was brilliant, methodical, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to find answers in cases that stumped other medical examiners. During her 30-year academic career, she had consulted on over 5,000 autopsies and testified as an expert witness in hundreds of criminal trials across 3 states. When she passed away from pancreatic cancer in February 2019, I was devastated, both personally and professionally. I had been working as the chief medical examiner for Kanawha County, handling suspicious deaths, industrial accidents, and drug overdose cases that were becoming increasingly common throughout West Virginia. It was important work, but the relentless exposure to violence and tragedy was taking its toll on my mental health and personal relationships. Dr. Blackwood's will came as a complete surprise. She had left me her entire funeral home operation, including the Victorian mansion that housed the business, the modern preparation facilities she had built in the early 2000s, and most importantly, her extensive collection of forensic and medical texts that had made her one of the most respected pathologists in the region. The inheritance also included something I hadn't expected: detailed records dating back to 1944 that documented every single person who had been laid to rest through Blackwood Associates. At 45, recently divorced, and increasingly burned out from investigating overdose deaths and mining accidents, the prospect of using my medical training to help grieving families rather than testifying in criminal trials felt like a chance at redemption. I submitted my resignation to the county medical examiner's office and moved to Thornfield Hollow in April 2019. Thornfield Hollow was nestled in a valley between 2 ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, accessible only by a winding 2-lane road that followed Copper Creek for nearly 12 miles before reaching the main settlement. The community had been built around coal mining in the early 1900s, but when the mines closed in the 1980s, most residents had transitioned to small-scale farming, logging, or commuting to jobs in larger towns. The population had dwindled to just under 1,800 people, spread across the main village and dozens of hollows and ridges that branched off from the Central Valley. The funeral home itself was a magnificent 3-story Queen Anne Victorian that Dr. Blackwood's great-grandfather had built in 1923. The main floor contained viewing rooms, a chapel that could seat about 60 people, and administrative offices. The second floor had been converted into my living quarters, featuring original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a library where Dr. Blackwood had kept her medical texts and research materials. Behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway, was the preparation facility that Dr. Blackwood had designed herself, a modern, sterile environment with everything needed needed for embalming, restoration, and cremation services. But it was the basement that truly revealed Dr. Blackwood's obsession with documentation and record keeping. The entire lower level had been converted into a climate-controlled archive containing filing cabinets, storage boxes, and catalog systems that documented 75 years of funeral services. Every death certificate, burial permit, family contact sheet, and service arrangement was preserved and indexed with the precision of a medical research facility. Blackwood had even maintained photographic records of her work, ostensibly for quality control and educational purposes, but the collection was so comprehensive it bordered on the archival. During my first 6 months in Thornfield Hollow, I immersed myself completely in understanding both the business and the community it served. The work was exactly what I had hoped for: dignified, meaningful, and emotionally rewarding in ways that forensic pathology had never been. I helped families say goodbye to elderly patriarchs who had worked in the mines for 40 years. I comforted mothers who had lost sons to military service overseas. I arranged services for community pillars who had taught school for decades or run the same general store for generations. The families of Thornfield Hollow were deeply interconnected through marriages, shared hardships, and mutual support that went back multiple generations. Names like Ashford, Caldwell, Morrison, Petrosky, and Whitfield appeared consistently throughout the funeral home records, creating a tapestry of relationships that told the story of the entire community. I frequently found myself serving multiple generations of the same families, sometimes within the span of a few months, as elderly residents passed away in clusters during particularly harsh winters. Dr. Blackwood had served this community with extraordinary dedication. Her records showed that she had handled an average of 45 to 50 funerals per year, ranging from elaborate services for prominent families to simple graveside ceremonies for those with limited means. What impressed me most was her willingness to provide services regardless of a family's ability to pay. Her files contained hundreds of notations indicating reduced fees, payment plans, or services provided at no charge for families facing financial hardship. By the fall of 2019, I had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and fulfilling. I was learning the intricate family histories and relationships that defined Thornfield Hollow. I was developing friendships with local business owners, attending community events, and even considering the possibility of dating again for the first time since my divorce. The pace of life was slower than what I had known in Charleston, but the depth of human connection more than compensated for any sense of isolation. The discovery that would eventually destroy this peaceful existence began with my decision to digitize Dr. Blackwood's paper records. The project was partly practical. I wanted to create digital backups of important documents and make client information more easily searchable, but it was also personal. Working through Dr. Blackwood's meticulous files felt like continuing a conversation with my mentor about the families and community she had served for nearly 3 decades. I started with the most recent records and worked backward chronologically, scanning documents and entering information into a database system I had designed to track family relationships, burial locations, and service details. The work was time-consuming, but oddly meditative. Each file told a story not just of death and grief, but of lives lived within a close-knit community where individual stories were interwoven across generations. It was during a snowy evening in January 2020, while working through files from 1998, that I encountered the first document that made me stop and examine something more carefully. The death certificate was for a woman named Cordelia Jane Ashford, age 82, who had died of congestive heart failure on October 14, 1998. Mrs. Ashford had been a prominent member of the community, the widow of a mine supervisor, and the mother of 6 children who had all remained in the area. Her funeral had been one of the larger services of that year, with over 200 people attending. What caught my attention wasn't anything unusual about Mrs. Ashford's death or funeral arrangements. It was the fact that I distinctly remembered handling funeral arrangements for a woman with the exact same name just 6 months earlier, in July 2019. I had a clear memory of meeting with her daughter, discussing casket selections, and coordinating with the local cemetery for burial arrangements. I set aside the 1998 file and retrieved the more recent records from my current filing system. The 2019 death certificate was for Cordelia Jane Ashford, age 103, who had died peacefully in her sleep on July 18, 2019. The next of kin was listed as her daughter, Rebecca Ashford Morrison, the same person I remembered meeting with to arrange the funeral service. My first assumption was that I was looking at records for a daughter and mother who shared the same name, a common practice in families with strong naming traditions. But when I compared the social security numbers, they were identical. The birth dates were the same: March 3, 1960. The parents' names listed on both death certificates were identical: William James Ashford and Mary Catherine Sullivan Ashford. According to the documents in front of me, the same woman had died twice, once in 1998 at age 82, and again in 2019 at age 103. I spent the next 3 hours going through both sets of records with the methodical attention to detail that Dr. Blackwood had taught me during my forensic training. The 1998 records were complete and comprehensive. Death certificate signed by Dr. Harold Templeton, who had been the primary physician in Thornfield Hollow for over 40 years. Burial permit issued by the county clerk. Detailed invoices for funeral services, embalming, and burial arrangements. Even photographs that Dr. Blackwood had taken during preparation, showing an elderly woman who appeared to be in her early 80s. The 2019 records were equally complete. Death certificate signed by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had taken over Dr. Templeton's practice when he retired in 2003. All proper permits and documentation, detailed service arrangements that I had personally coordinated, and photographs that I had taken myself, showing an elderly woman who appeared to be over 100 years old. But when I examined the photographs side by side under the magnifying glass Dr. Blackwood had used for detailed examinations, I realized I was looking at the same person. The facial bone structure was identical, the same distinctive scar above the left eyebrow that I remembered Rebecca mentioning had resulted from a childhood accident. The same unusual dental work that was visible in both sets of preparation photographs. The woman in the 2019 photographs appeared older, more frail, with thinner hair and more pronounced aging. But it was unmistakably the same individual. Somehow, according to our records, Cordelia Jane Ashford had died and been buried in 1998. I looked up the burial locations in our cemetery records. The 1998 burial had been in Thornfield Community Cemetery, plot section C, grave number 47. The 2019 burial had been in the same cemetery, but in the newer section E, grave number 128. I had personally overseen the 2019 burial and remembered standing at the graveside during the service. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept returning to Dr. Blackwood's office, now my office, to examine the records again, looking for some explanation that would make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe there had been an error in the social security system. Maybe Dr. Blackwood had accidentally duplicated paperwork from an earlier case. Maybe I had misread dates or mixed up files, but every examination confirmed what I had initially discovered. We had complete, detailed, properly documented records showing that the same woman had died twice, 21 years apart, and had been buried in 2 different graves in the same cemetery. The next morning, I drove to Thornfield Community Cemetery, located on a hillside about 2 miles outside the main village. The cemetery was divided into sections based on when they had been developed, with the oldest graves dating to the 1890s, and newer sections added as the community had grown. Section C, where Cordelia Ashford had supposedly been buried in 1998, contained graves from the 1990s and early 2000s. Section E, where I had personally witnessed her burial in 2019, was the newest area of the cemetery. I found both graves exactly where the records indicated they should be. Plot C47 was marked with a granite headstone reading Cordelia Jane Ashford, beloved mother and grandmother, 1916 to 1998. The grave showed signs of having been properly maintained over the years, with flowers that appeared to have been placed there recently. Plot E128 was marked with a newer granite headstone reading Cordelia Jane Ashford, beloved mother and grandmother, 1916 to 2019. This grave still showed the disturbed earth and fresh sod that indicated recent burial. I stood between those two graves for over an hour, trying to process what I was seeing. Both grave sites appeared authentic. Both headstones showed appropriate weathering for their supposed ages. Both were located in sections of the cemetery that were actively maintained and regularly visited by family members. That afternoon, I called Rebecca Ashford Morrison, the daughter I had worked with, to arrange the 2019 funeral service. Rebecca was in her 70s and had lived in Thornfield Hollow her entire life. When I explained that I was updating the funeral home's records and wanted to verify some details about her mother's service, she was happy to help. Mama lived to be 103, Rebecca told me with obvious pride. She was sharp as a tack right up until the end. Used to say the mountain air and hard work kept her young. Mrs. Morrison, I said carefully, I want to make sure I have the correct information in our files. Can you confirm when your mother passed away? July 18, 2019, she replied without hesitation. It was a Friday evening. She went to sleep after dinner and just didn't wake up the next morning. Dr. Walsh said it was the most peaceful passing she'd ever seen, and she's buried at Thornfield Community Cemetery. Yes, in the new section, Plot E128. The whole family visits every Sunday after church. Mama would have liked that. She never missed a Sunday service in her life. I asked Rebecca about her mother's life, her health history, her role in the community. Everything she told me matched perfectly with the information in the 2019 records. She spoke about her mother's remarkable longevity, her independence well into her 90s, her role as the family matriarch for 6 children, 18 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. She used to joke that she was too stubborn to die. Rebecca laughed, said she had to stick around long enough to see all her great-grandchildren grow up. Rebecca, I said, choosing my words very carefully, do you remember anything about your mother being ill or hospitalized back in 1998? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. 1998. No, that was a good year for Mama. She was still living independently then, still driving herself to church and the grocery store. Why do you ask? I'm just trying to make sure all our records are accurate. Sometimes families have health scares that don't result in hospitalization. No, nothing like that. Mama was healthy as a horse in 1998. That was the year she finally agreed to let us install a phone in her house, and she spent half her time complaining that people could call her whenever they wanted. After ending the call, I sat in my office, surrounded by the 2 sets of records, trying to understand what I had discovered. According to Rebecca, her mother had been alive and healthy in 1998, living independently and actively participating in community life. But according to Dr. Blackwood's meticulously documented records, Cordelia Jane Ashford had died of congestive heart failure on October 14, 1998, and had been buried in Plot C47 after a funeral service attended by over 200 people. I spent the rest of that day examining every detail of the 1998 records, looking for any indication that they might be forgeries or errors. But everything appeared authentic. Dr. Blackwood's handwriting on the preparation notes, her signature on internal documents. The photographs showed her typical attention to detail and technical proficiency. The funeral service records included names of pallbearers, flower arrangements, and music selections that were consistent with other services from that time period. Most disturbing of all, the 1998 records included a copy of the obituary that had been published in the Thornfield Hollow Weekly Gazette. I drove to the newspaper office and asked to see their archived copies from October 1998. The obituary was there, exactly as documented in our files, announcing the death of Cordelia Jane Ashford and providing details about her funeral service at Blackwood and Associates. According to every piece of evidence I could examine, Cordelia Jane Ashford had definitely died and been buried in October 1998. But according to her daughter and my own personal experience, she had also definitely died and been buried in July 2019, which meant that somehow, a woman who had been dead and buried for 21 years had continued living and had died again. The weeks following my discovery of Cordelia Ashford's impossible double burial consumed me with an obsession that bordered on professional madness. I couldn't focus on current funeral arrangements without wondering if I was creating another inexplicable mystery for some future director to discover. Every night, I found myself in Dr. Blackwood's archive, methodically examining records with the forensic precision that had once made me one of West Virginia's most respected medical examiners. What I found in those basement files would shake the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about death, identity, and the nature of human existence. 3 days after confirming Cordelia's dual burial records, I discovered the second case. This time it was Harold Vincent Caldwell, a retired coal miner, who according to our records had died of black lung disease on September 3, 1995, at age 71. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Templeton, the burial permit properly filed, and the service well documented with over 100 attendees. Harold had been buried in Thornfield Community Cemetery, Plot B23, but Harold Vincent Caldwell had also died on January 12, 2003, at age 79, from complications of emphysema. Same social security number, same birth date, same physical description, different doctor, Dr. Walsh this time, but equally complete documentation. He had been buried in Plot D15, just 4 sections away from his previous grave. I called Harold's son Tommy Caldwell, who ran the local hardware store. When I asked about his father's death, Tommy spoke about the 2003 funeral with clear, detailed memories. Dad fought that black lung for years, Tommy told me. Dr. Walsh did everything she could, but you know how it is with miners. The coal dust finally got him in January 2003. We had the service here at Blackwood's, and half the town showed up. Dad would have been proud. When I carefully asked about 1995, Tommy seemed confused. That was a rough year for Dad's health, but he pulled through. That's when Dr. Templeton first diagnosed the black lung, but Dad had 8 more good years after that. I found Harold's obituary in both the 1995 and 2003 newspaper archives. Both complete, both published, both announcing funeral services at our facility. By the end of that week, I had discovered 7 cases of duplicate deaths spanning from 1987 to 2019. Each victim had died twice, years apart, with complete documentation for both deaths. Family members consistently remembered only the later death, with no memory or awareness of the earlier funeral that our records proved had taken place. The pattern was becoming clear, but the implications were impossible to accept. According to our meticulously maintained records, at least 7 people had died and been buried, then somehow continued living only to die again years later. The gap between deaths ranged from 8 to 21 years, but in every case, The second death occurred with family members who had no memory of the first. I needed to see the graves themselves. On a gray February morning, I drove to Thornfield Community Cemetery with a detailed map of every plot location and a digital camera. What I found there defied every principle of physics and biology I had learned during my medical training. The graves were all exactly where our records indicated they should be. Cordelia Ashford's 1998 grave in Section C showed appropriate weathering and settling for a 22-year-old burial. The headstone had the gray patina of age, and the ground had the slight depression that occurs when a grave settles over time. Her 2019 grave in Section E still showed the characteristics of a recent burial: fresh sod, a new headstone, and the raised earth that hadn't yet settled. Harold Caldwell's 1995 grave displayed similar authenticity. The headstone showed nearly 3 decades of weather exposure, and I could see that flowers had been placed there recently, suggesting ongoing family visits. His 2003 grave, located just a few hundred yards away, showed the settling patterns of a 20-year-old burial. Standing in that cemetery, looking at 14 graves containing 7 people who had each died twice, I felt my rational understanding of the world beginning to collapse. Every grave showed physical evidence of actual burial. Every headstone displayed appropriate aging. Every site was maintained and visited by family members who remembered only the later deaths. But our records proved that earlier funerals had definitely taken place. Blackwood's photographs, detailed preparation notes, and service documentation were too comprehensive and consistent to be fabrications. The newspaper obituaries confirmed that these deaths had been publicly announced and acknowledged by the community. I decided to exhume one of the graves. Getting legal permission to exhume remains requires a court order, which requires probable cause of criminal activity or significant public health concerns. I couldn't exactly tell a judge that I needed to dig up Harold Caldwell because our records suggested he had died twice. Instead, I filed a petition claiming potential contamination issues related to the old mine drainage that occasionally affected the cemetery's groundwater. The exhumation took place on March 15, 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to shut down normal life across West Virginia. I had arranged for the work to be done discreetly, with only myself, 2 cemetery workers, and Dr. Walsh present as the official witness. We started with Harold Caldwell's 1995 grave in Plot B23. When we reached the burial vault, 6 feet down, everything appeared normal. The concrete vault was intact and properly sealed. Inside, we found Harold's casket exactly as it should have been, containing skeletal remains consistent with a 25-year-old burial. The remains showed no signs of disturbance, and the personal effects that had been buried with Harold, his mining helmet, his wedding ring, his favorite pocket watch, were all present and accounted for. From a forensic standpoint, this was a completely normal exhumation of a 25-year-old burial. Harold Vincent Caldwell had definitely been buried in this grave in 1995, and he had remained there undisturbed until we opened the vault. But according to his family, Harold had continued living until 2003. According to our records, he had been buried again in Plot D15 after dying a second time from the same lung disease that had supposedly killed him 8 years earlier. Dr. Walsh witnessed the entire exhumation and confirmed that the remains were consistent with the 1995 death certificate she had reviewed from our files. "Elena," she said quietly as we sealed the grave, "I don't understand what you're trying to prove here, but this is definitely a 25-year-old burial. If you suspected Harold was still alive in 1995, this evidence contradicts that theory." I couldn't explain to Dr. Walsh that I wasn't questioning whether Harold had died in 1995. Our records proved he had. What I couldn't understand was how he had also died in 2003, with his family maintaining clear memories of that later funeral while having no awareness of the earlier one. That night, Alone in my office, with the implications of what the exhumation had revealed, I made a decision that would ultimately force me to leave Thornfield Hollow forever. I was going to dig up Harold's 2003 grave, working alone in the pre-dawn darkness of March 16th, using equipment I had quietly borrowed from the cemetery's maintenance shed. I exhumed plot D15. It took me nearly 4 hours of careful digging, but when I reached the burial vault, I found exactly what I had both hoped and feared to discover. The vault contained Harold Caldwell's 2003 casket, with skeletal remains consistent with a 17-year-old burial, the same mining helmet, the same wedding ring, the same pocket watch. But forensic analysis of the bone structure, dental work, and personal effects confirmed that these were the remains of the same man I had exhumed just 12 hours earlier from a grave 200 yards away. Harold Vincent Caldwell had been buried twice, and his remains existed in both graves simultaneously. Standing in that cemetery at dawn, covered in dirt, and staring at proof that a single person could exist in 2 graves at once, I finally understood that I was confronting something that transcended medical science, forensic pathology, and rational explanation. The duplicate burial records weren't clerical errors or false memories. They were documentation of something impossible that had somehow become real in Thornfield Hollow. Over the following weeks, as the pandemic lockdowns gave me isolation to process what I had discovered, I began to piece together a theory that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of death and human existence. The evidence suggested that in Thornfield Hollow, some people were somehow dying twice, first as documented in Dr. Blackwood's records, then again years later, as remembered by their families. But the most disturbing realization was that this phenomenon wasn't random. Every case of duplicate death I had discovered involved people who had been particularly beloved in the community, individuals whose loss would have been devastating to their families and neighbors. Cordelia Ashford, the matriarch of 6 children, Harold Caldwell, a respected miner and community leader. Each person whose death had been delayed was someone the community desperately didn't want to lose. I began to suspect that Dr. Blackwood had discovered this phenomenon years before I inherited the funeral home. Her obsessive record-keeping, her comprehensive documentation, and her decision to leave academic medicine to run a small-town funeral home suddenly made sense in a completely different context. She hadn't been simply providing funeral services to a rural community. She had been documenting and perhaps facilitating something impossible in her personal journals, which I found hidden behind her medical texts. Dr. Blackwood had written extensively about her observations of what she called temporal displacement events in Thornfield Hollow. Her notes suggested that the close-knit nature of the community, combined with the intense emotional bonds between families who had shared hardships for generations, somehow created conditions that allowed certain deaths to be postponed. The final entry in her journal, written just weeks before her own death, contained a confession that explained everything. I have spent 27 years helping this community hold on to their loved ones longer than nature intended. The cost has been my own sanity, and the knowledge that I have been complicit in something that defies natural law. Elena will inherit this burden, and I pray she has the strength to either continue my work or find a way to end it. Dr. Blackwood had known exactly what she was leaving me when she died. She had chosen me not just to run a funeral home, but to become the guardian of Thornfield Hollow's impossible secret. I spent 3 more months in that mountain community, arranging normal funerals for people who died once and stayed dead, while struggling with the knowledge that some of my clients would eventually die again, years or decades in the future. The weight of that knowledge, combined with the isolation of the pandemic and the impossibility of sharing my discovery with anyone who would believe me, gradually destroyed my ability to function. In June 2020, I sold Blackwood Associates to a corporate funeral service and returned to urban pathology practice. I told everyone I was leaving because of financial pressures from the pandemic, but the truth was that I couldn't continue operating in a reality where death itself was negotiable. I never told anyone about the duplicate burial records, the exhumations, or Dr. Blackwood's journals. Who would believe that a small Appalachian community had somehow found a way to postpone death through collective will and intense emotional bonds? The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were too disturbing to share. But I couldn't leave Thornfield Hollow completely behind. Every few months, I checked the obituaries in the Thornfield Hollow Weekly Gazette online. I'm watching for the second deaths of people whose first funerals I handled during my time there. So far, none of my clients have died again, but I know from Dr. Blackwood's patterns that it could be years or decades before the delayed deaths occur. And sometimes, late at night in my city apartment, I wonder if I made the right choice in leaving. Dr. Blackwood spent nearly 3 decades helping families in Thornfield Hollow hold on to their loved ones longer than should have been possible. She sacrificed her career, her sanity, and ultimately her life to give grieving families extra years with people they couldn't bear to lose. Maybe that was a burden worth carrying. Maybe there are some mysteries that deserve to be protected rather than solved. Maybe love really can be stronger than death, even if the cost is everything we think we know about the natural order of the world. But I couldn't carry that weight. The knowledge that death might be negotiable, that some people get to die twice, while others die only once, that reality itself might bend to accommodate our deepest emotional needs. It was too much for one person to bear alone. I returned to the city, to normal death certificates and single burials and families who grieve once and move on. But I'll never forget what I learned in Thornfield Hollow, that somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, love and community bonds run so deep that even death has to wait its turn.